London's economy is booming. So is its population, or at least they were before Corona times. But who is this thriving city for? 10% of Londoners own half the wealth, and the bottom 50% only own 5. The top 10% of highest earning Londoners earn twice as much as the next 10%. London has more billionaires than anywhere else in the world, arguably, because it's really hard to measure where billionaires live. London has the most basic poverty in London, with a third of children not having the income for a basic standard of living. Some places in London, it's up to 50%. London also has the highest property prices in the UK, but the highest proportion of renters. Look at these child poverty rates, particularly in the East End. Now, to some degree, this is simply the story of London. William Booth, for instance, the founder of the Salvation Army, stated, "As there is in darkest Africa, is there also not a darkest England?" He's referring here to London. May we not find parallel at our own doors and discover within a stone's throw of our cathedrals and palaces similar horrors to which the anthropologist Henry Stanley has found existing in the great Ecuadorian forest? But let's see how it plays out today in London. We can see there is mass inequality in income. As I was mentioning earlier, there's a big difference between the highest decile and the next highest decile, but you can see the bottom deciles very, very small. And much of this comes from London's finance industry. You can see these fellows here earn a lot of money. First year salaries, £50,000, going up to the hundreds of thousands. But this is not the predominant source of wealth in London. Instead, it's ownership of wealth, as we can see here. Highest decile, the 10th decile, earning huge amounts. Oh, owning huge amounts. Now, some of this wealth traditionally came from the proceeds of empire, whether it's a slave owner like Robert Milligan or simply trading and buying parcels of land around the empire. The rest came through land ownership, often passed on through hereditary privilege. In 1873, for instance, land in England was owned by 4.5% of the population, almost all of it, that is. By 2010, a third of the land in Britain was owned by around 1,200 aristocratic families. That includes the Queen. And if we look at this map of central London, citing, say, the British Museum around here, we can see this is some of the great estates and how much they own of central London. If we look, for example, at the Grosvenor estate in the blue, leading from Pimlico, right by the Thames, up through Belgravia, taking a little break, and into Mayfair, that estate was inherited by the family, or by the family line, in 1677. At the time, it would have just been farmland mostly, and it's now worth 12.7 billion, or at least the Duke of Westminster, who controls it, is worth that. So all the leases through this area in central London, whether property or housing or commercial property, goes through to this inherited wealth. But increasingly, that old money is being replaced by foreign ownership. So this is, and we're split here between, it's quite a weird English or a British structure, but property ownership is split between freehold, where you own the land, and leasehold, where you lease it. We can see this is foreign ownership of property in central London. And you can see quite a lot of the Grosvenor estate is actually owned or controlled by foreign interests. And this is one of the things that we see in London, that we're starting to get a global elite. It's a kind of defining feature of the 21st century, that we now have this global superclass who live in a world, a privatized world, that's quite divorced. I've got from the other 99%, we won't say 99.9%, in that they live in a bubble in which we might have housing where you can't see people from the street, both in the sense that we have, say, a car with blacked out windows, or as blacked out as they possibly can be, that's parked in a below ground house, below ground parking structure. So you can never see the car, you never see the people in the car, and then they might go to private schools or shop at exclusive Boutiques that are appointment only go to exclusive clubs that the public are not welcome to. Children go to private schools, private healthcare, really cut off from the rest of the world. This is particularly keenly seen in the developing world, but it's also a big feature of London life. And so we see, as you see in these headlines, that London's um, old money, the old upper class, are now being forced out, as the headlines say, by this global elite. So if we look at, say, Kensington Palace Gardens, the most expensive real estate in London, this is right by, surprisingly enough, Kensington Palace in the west of London, which is attached to Hyde Park. You can see the helicopter there in some of the grounds. If we look, we've got embassies there, but we've also got, say, homes for the Sultan of Brunei and a couple of the English elite as well, at least John Hunt. Huge wealth in central London. And we also see it uh, in sort of flashy displays around, particularly Mayfair and Belgravia in central West London, where we might see a lot of supercars or a lot of what the old upper class, the old English upper class, would have called quite vulgar displays of wealth, say designer bags and designer clothing, in which the designer element is particularly visible. And this global elite may not see themselves as English or British, but as citizens of the world, or not even citizens, are part of a global culture of the elite. If we take this quote from the book This is London, in which he interviewed an Egyptian heiress, which he used the name Nahala. If we take about three-quarters of the way down, she says, I'm not becoming English. There's a global culture. It's very hard to say what's making someone English, like cricket and all that. That used to be English, but it's not anymore. You know, I feel in London there are so many people here from so many different places. They've kind of created their own thing. What she's suggesting, and it's something that we see in across all classes, in which we say it's a multicultural city, but she's almost saying she can avoid English culture. She doesn't need to fit in because she could easily be in the south of France or in Dubai or in Manhattan. Where she lives is perhaps unimportant. The same lifestyle can exist. Now, this stands in absolute contrast to the lives of most Londoners. Let's take here this map of the cost of renting in the capital. So, what are these figures showing? They're showing the percentage of income that rent takes up out of the average monthly salary. So let's say we take Southwark in central, sorry, South London, right in the middle there. In Southwark, people pay on average 70% of their wages on rent, which is quite incredible, really. Look at some of those figures around the place. There could be people in Southwark live there but work somewhere else. But you can see for a lot of people, and this is renters, so they don't own property most likely, wages just disappear to housing. And of course, that rent goes to the rentier class, those who own property and rent it out. As a consequence of the high rent, which incidentally has fallen rapidly during the pandemic, many Londoners are living precarious lives. And they're living precarious lives not just because of the rent, but because of wages. And this is perhaps something of an irony. More Londoners than ever are employed, but during the period from 2008 to 2014, real wages fell. 20% of Londoners now earn less than the London living wage, and 95% of jobs created in the period of 2012 to 2014 paid less than this wage, a trend which has continued. And there's been a 765% growth of what they call zero hours contracts from 2010 to 2019. These are contracts in which you are employed by a company, but not on any regular hours. They can give you 0 hours a week, they can give you 8 hours a week, they can dismiss you at any time. And so, a lot of poverty we have in London is not through unemployment. Instead, it's through working poverty. 27% of Londoners live in poverty, and two-thirds of children who are in poverty are in working households. Let's look, for instance, at those living below the London living wage. We can see, firstly, significant increases. If we look at all, we've seen an increase from 2008 to 2015 of 54%. But we could also see those in the hospitality sector, 68% living in the hospitality sector, living on less than the London living wage. Now, during this pandemic, in 2020, we will see so many of those hospitality workers are either now being forced to live on 80% of their wages through government support, or they're losing their jobs if they aren't on any kind of secure contracts, making this poverty even worse. That's why so many are leaving London at the moment. In the report by the MP, or the once MP, Frank Field, and researcher Andrew Forsey on sweated labour, Uber, and the gig economy, the gig economy being those working, not working, people who do jobs like everything from cleaning to Uber driving to delivering fast food, who work as self-contractors. So Uber doesn't give people employment rights. Instead, you are a business person contracted to them. And Field and Forsey said, there's a sizable group of people who bear the largely unseen scars of the gig economy. They are the hidden army who, despite being classed as self-employed, work very long hours, often one particular company, in return for chronically low rates of pay. Moreover, they do so without the right to paid leave, to the national living wage, and to challenge an unfair dismissal. For example, which are the protections granted to workers and employees? And they called this sweated labour, referring back to an 1890 report from the House of Lords, which defined sweated labour as when earnings were barely sufficient to sustain existence. Hours of labour were such as to make the lives of workers periods of almost ceaseless toil, and the conditions were injurious to health of the workers and dangerous to the public. And the home of the gig economy is in London. Now, Karl Marx, who was a Londoner for a large period of his life, would have said, yeah, this is what happens in a capitalist city. And Marx, he saw this very well. He argued that the accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore, at the same time, accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole. And for Marx living in London, this was easy to see. If I flick back to this, you could go down the docks and see people desperate for work, as Robert Mayhew in London Labour and the London Poor wrote in 1851. As the foreman, he's observing people looking for work around the docks. As the foreman calls from a book the name, some even jump upon the backs of others, so as to lift themselves high above the rest, and attract the attention of him who hires them. All are shouting. Indeed, it is a sight to sadden the most callous, to see thousands of men struggling for only one day's hire. To look in the faces of that hungry crowd is to see a sight that must ever be remembered. These were the labour conditions of Marx's time, but he also worked around in the British Museum, in which we had these stately estates. Marx could see that this was both sides of the city. Now, this idea, to some degree, this idea of a tale of two cities disappeared during the sort of more secure industrial post-war industrial era. By the 1980s, though, in deindustrializing cities, we saw a significant rise in inequality, which Manuel Castells, writing with John Mollenkopf, called the Jewel City. Now, Mollenkopf and Castells were writing specifically about New York. But this thesis was expanded. This thesis of the Jewel City was expanded upon by Saskia Saskin in her book, The Global City, in which she wrote about London, Tokyo, and New York. She spoke specifically, the term she used was social and spatial polarization. She argued that the expansion of low-wage jobs as a function of growth implies a reorganization of capital-labor relation. What she meant by this is that in the post-industrial city, low-wage jobs are all part of growth. As in, it's not that we look at the growth of a city and think, oh, there's an anomaly here that people are getting poorer. She suggested, as Marx had before her, that there is a necessary relationship between the growing of wealth in the capitalist city and low wage jobs. Specifically, she argued that new forms of inner city gentrification are very labor intensive. They require more people to produce authentic goods and services and experiences. And therefore, in order to reproduce this, they require low wage workers. And low wage workers are available because the jobs are in the city and because there are no manufacturing jobs available. And therefore, we must have a service. Um, sorry, unskilled workers must be service workers. So she argued that low wage work is all part of the global city, of the dual city, of the polarized city. And we see this in London, the spatial organization of it. So the key here is people who work in what we might just call professional or white collar jobs. You see through the West and central London, and you can see there's a belt there that goes into the wealthy southwest London. We have much higher proportion of people in proportional jobs, whereas on the outskirts of London, you have people working in more service occupations and most likely travelling into central London. This is quite a big reverse for London. If I skip it to this one here, this is from 2001 to 2012, 2011. But I want you to see the change that occurred during this period. London used to be a place, or at least de-industrializing London and industrialized London, in which the poor, particularly in the East End, the poor were crammed into the inner city, particularly the East End of London. From the 1990s, the place to be was inner city London, and people started flocking back there. As a consequence, London's spatial inequality has reversed. It's not in the inner city; it's in the outskirts, in which people are being forced to commute large distances to get to their jobs. And this spatial inequality, maps on to ethnicity. Where we see London has some green fringes. If we look at this map, where we see literal green fringes for the map, white English and white non-British populations. We see that there's some concentrations of white British in the central city, and I'm using this, sorry, it's sort of synonymous for wealth. But around the outskirts of the inner city, we see black or black British and Asian or Asian British populations forced further and further out. We might also argue that the white working class, the Cockney populations, are being forced to the outskirts, particularly in the east of the city, heading into the county of Essex. Now, for the author and urbanist Richard Florida, who was the author of the book The Rise of the Creative Classes, in which he argued that people wanted to come into the inner city to enjoy density and diversity. He argued in his book, The New Urban Crisis, that the larger, denser, and more knowledge intensive and tech based a city or metro is, the more unequal it tends to be. Superstar cities and knowledge hubs are not just the places where inequality is most on display. Their success is inextricably tied to the very clustering of talents and firms that shapes the widening gap between rich or poor. So, Florida argues that the first urban crisis was that of deindustrialization, where people didn't want to be in the city, so fled to the suburbs, leaving only an underclass and plummeting rents and leases. The new urban crisis, he argues, is caused by increased demand for city, in which people want to cluster together. But of course, not everyone can cluster. And so some people are forced out of the space. As people cannot afford to live in the city, they move further and further out until they cannot enjoy the benefits of it. And young, talented people, his creative classes, are forced elsewhere. So it's in this crisis that London now lives. It's a highly polarized city. Not politically, London remains very liberal, but economically. And interestingly enough, the most liberal places, certainly in North America, are also the most unequal. And so London's strength, its creative, cool, knowledge-based economy, also produces its weaknesses for so many low wages, precarious existences. Will this continue? The pandemic has certainly thrown London's structures up in the air. Rents are falling, people are leaving, low wage work is disappearing as people work from home. The future of London is very much uncertain.